Yo, welcome to my place. I'm your host, American Warhorse. So glad you could stop by and spend some time. This episode is dedicated to my shipmates and all those men and women who served this great country, regardless of whether in peace or war, who never came home, as well as to the Blue and Gold Star families. Now, I love history of all kinds. Today, I'm going to share with you the story of 5 men who made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms we sometimes take for granted. I'm talking about the Sullivan brothers. I will also share some scripture with you. Now, to help with this topic, I need you to do a couple things, please. Find a map of the Solomon Islands chain. This is the one you're looking for. Okay? Just go to Google Images, and you should find it. Set it aside because we're going to use it a little bit later on. I'd like for you also to look up this ship, USS Juno. You'll know you have the right one when you see the number 52 on the bow, which is the front end for you non-nautical types. Make sure you find one marking her size so you have a good idea of just how big that ship is. I'd also like you to find a picture of these men. These are the Sullivan brothers. Just search Sullivan brother images and it'll pop right up. Oh, one more thing. Place a marker in John 15, verse 13, please. No cheating and looking in advance. We're saving that for later. Take your time. I'll be here when you get back. The Sullivan brothers were the sons of Thomas and Aletta Sullivan of Waterloo, Iowa. They had one sister named Genevieve. Now, there was nothing particularly outstanding about the Sullivan brothers, except for one thing: their loyalty to each other and the family. The bond between these men, George, Frank, Red, Matt, and Al, was strong. It was so strong, in fact, that they convinced the Navy bureaucracy to let them all serve together on the same ship. And as anybody who's dealt with that kind of bureaucracy, that's no mean feat. When we go in, we want to go in together, said George, the eldest. Worst comes to worst, we'll all have gone down together. On November the 13th, 1942, his words became prophetic. Now let's take a minute to put everything in context. Less than 1 year had passed since the disaster at Pearl Harbor. For the next 6 months, the Japanese seemed unstoppable. Everywhere they went across the Pacific, from India and China to as far north as Attu and Kiska in Alaska, they scored victory after victory. They defeated the British in Singapore and Malaya. They sank the Asiatic Fleet, which was a combined command of warships and support vessels from America, Britain, and the Dutch and Australia over the next several months. And because the American Navy was in no shape to help, the Philippines eventually fell, ending in the tragedy that became known as the Bataan Death March. All of these territories were now under the flag of the rising sun. But America began to fight back. Though we were still reeling from the loss at Pearl Harbor, what was left of the fleet met the Japanese at the Coral Sea and fought them to a standstill. Then came the miracle of the Battle of Midway, the first American victory in June 1942. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Each of them had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, so it gave a measure of revenge to the Navy for that humiliation at Pearl. Now it was time to take the fight to the Japanese. The target was the island of Guadalcanal. Why here? Why fight in unimaginably horrible conditions where death came from either a bullet, an exploding shell, or from mosquitoes infesting the island, all of which carried malaria? What made the place worth dying for? An airstrip. That's it. You see, Australia was under the very real threat of invasion. A major shipping route between the US and Australia would be cut off if the Japanese were allowed to place whole squadrons of bombers and fighters on the island. So in August 1942, under the codename Operation Watchtower, An American fleet of transports with the 1st Marine Division aboard, along with escorting warships and supply ships, got underway to invade the island and take it from the Japanese. For months, battles raged on land, sea, and in the air. The Marines were hanging on, but just barely. Both sides were losing ships in these battles. The fighting was incredibly vicious. By day, American ships ruled the waves. At night, it was the Japanese. In fact, the Japanese were so adept at night fighting that the American Navy suffered some of its worst defeats in its history, starting with the Battle of Savo Island. By late October, with the fighting in and around Guadalcanal still raging, the USS Juneau arrived on the scene. Aboard her were the Sullivan brothers. Now let's refer to that map I had you look up, please. To the left side, just above the island of Guadalcanal itself, you'll see a little speck of an island called Savo Island. Now, in between these two islands is where the battle I'm about to describe took place. Oh, just so you know, that body of water just above Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound because of the incredible number of ships that were sunk in that area. Look it up sometime. You'll be astonished at just how many ships were sunk there. Now, the Japanese were determined to regain control of the island. The fleet they dispatched had enough firepower to practically blow the Marines off the island. They would follow it up by landing troops of their own. In fact, Japanese Admiral in Command, Isoroku Yamamoto, was so confident of victory that he approved a plan drawn up by his staff dictating the terms of surrender the American forces would have to submit to. Now take a look at the ship and those men. These brothers, along with 8 more sets of brothers aboard this ship, went into battle on the morning of November 13th, 1942. I want to give you some context here. The Americans were about to face Goliath. The Japanese naval force that was sent out that morning had about 10 times the firepower of the American force. For all intent and purpose, the American Navy was going on a suicide mission. But they saddled up anyway. What happened that morning has been characterized by historians as a barroom brawl with the lights turned off. For 40 minutes, in utter pitch blackness, ships fired at each other, sometimes at point-blank range. In fact, the fighting was so confusing that not only were both sides shooting at each other, sometimes they mistook their own ships for the enemy. And so they were shooting at their at the people on the same side. In fact, this battle was so ferocious that 3 admirals, 2 Americans and 1 Japanese, died in this battle, along with hundreds of sailors on both sides. Ira Wolford is an American correspondent who was with the Marines on the shore watching this battle. The action was, he wrote this: the action was illuminated in brief blinding flashes by Japanese searchlights which were shot out as soon as they were turned on, by the muzzle flashes from big guns, by fantastic streams of tracer bullets, and by huge orange-colored explosions as 2 Japanese ships and 1 of ours blew up. From the beach, it resembled a door to hell opening and closing over and over. Think about that for a minute. A door to hell opening and closing over and over. Now, when the smoke had cleared, the Americans were victorious. The Japanese were in retreat, but the cost to the Americans was very high. Of the 14 ships sent out that day, 12 had either been sunk or were so badly damaged they would be out of action for weeks. Only 2 were in good enough shape to go back into battle if they had to. They had sacrificed themselves and saved the Marines on Guadalcanal. Now, for the USS Juneau. It was in such bad shape that when a torpedo fired from a Japanese submarine struck it, and this was the words of Bruce McCandless, who witnessed it, it didn't just sink. It blew up like an erupting volcano. Take a look at the ship and picture this in your mind. That ship and nearly every man aboard essentially vaporized. Of a crew of over 600 men, 100 survived. They spent 8 days in shark-infested waters. By the time it was said and done, only 10 would be rescued. The survivors did report that Frank, Joe, and Matt died instantly. Al drowned the next day. George survived for 4 days before being driven insane with grief at the loss of his brothers. The 10 who were rescued remembered George's repeated cries of, "Where are my brothers? Where are my brothers?" as he searched the rafts and wreckage for any sign of them. By the 4th day, George was delirious. Though they were far out at sea, George told his shipmates he was going to swim to shore and take a bath. Stripping off his clothes, George plunged beneath the surface of the ocean from the raft he was in and was never seen again. On the morning of January 12, 1943, their father, Tom, was preparing for work when 3 men in uniform, an officer, a doctor, and a senior enlisted man, approached the door to his home. He instantly knew something was wrong. "I have some news about your boys," the naval officer said. "Which one?" asked Tom. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer replied. "All 5. The sacrifice made on the altar of freedom was great that day in November 1942. Wouldn't you agree? But what is sacrifice? What does it really mean? Well, let's take a look into that. We can agree that the sacrifices made by the men and women in our military, as well as their families, are great. So are those made by law enforcement and all other first responders. Those are the obvious ones and should be honored greatly. But there are other sacrifices that are equally important. Sacrifice of a parent, whether alone or with a spouse, who takes care of their family even when they're sick, or in the case of a single parent, are being crushed by depression and loneliness. The sacrifice made by grandparents in helping raise children almost full time because the biological parents are too selfish or lazy to care. The sacrifice of a woman who chooses to keep her child instead of aborting it. And so very many more. I'm sure you could come up with a very long list yourself. But there is one who made a sacrifice far greater than any of us could ever make. Turn your Bibles, please, to John 15, verse 13, if you would. Let's read this together. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends." In the case of the Sullivans and so many others, whether they were blood brothers and sisters or not, this is a great truth. Jesus knew this. That's why he said it. The highest exhibition of love the earth has ever seen, he demonstrated on Calvary. Not only for his friends, but for each of us. He laid down his life for us and sacrificed his relationship with the Father so we could live free through him if we choose to. That choice is one we must make every day, not only for ourselves, our families, and our friends, but as a nation. As this election cycle goes into full swing, That choice of living as free men and women is coming under ever increasing attack. We have choices to make. Now, we can easily choose to dismiss the comedic outbursts from the left as the mere ravings of the clearly unhinged. But isn't that how we got in this mess in the first place? We can choose to do nothing and watch as our constitutional rights and indeed our very way of life get dismantled around us. We would then have no right to complain. But then again, we probably won't have any rights at all by then. Or we can stand and fight together and make our voices heard and stand our ground against the loss of freedoms and our liberties which generations before us have fought for. There's a quote that I like that goes like this: "The rights of man were bought by the blood of brave men and the tears of their widows." Did you know that during the Revolutionary War, out of every 100 citizens, 10 wanted separation from British rule, but only 3 answered the call? The founding fathers were among them. Will it require sacrifice? Yeah. The left will always attack on many fronts. Channels will be shut down. Reputations and lives will be ruined. Death threats will be made and have already been made. For we fight not only against those who seek to destroy this country and people, but we fight against an ever-increasing darkness. If you're someone who's of the faith, that's not your imagination. All you got to do is look around. Sacrifice. What does that mean for you? Now, there is a happy note to this tale of the Sullivan brothers. Their sister Genevieve served in the Navy in honor of her brothers. President Franklin Roosevelt was so moved that he told the grieving family, "An entire nation shares your sorrow." He ordered that a ship be commissioned and named for the Fighting Sullivans. Their mother, Aletta, christened that ship. It had a large shamrock painted on the smokestack. She did this in 1943. Tom and Aletta made appearances and spoke to thousands of factory and shipyard workers in support of the war effort. More recently, another Sullivan christened the latest the USS The Sullivans, which is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, on the 20th of April, 1997, at Staten Island, New York. The Sullivans were common men who made an enormous sacrifice, said Kelly Loughran Sullivan. She is the granddaughter of Albert, the only one of the 5 brothers to get married. And on a final note, the wreck of the Juno was located on 17 March 2018. The cruiser rests in 13,800 feet of water below the surface, just off the coast of the Solomon Islands in several large pieces. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your many blessings upon us as individuals and upon this nation. Heavenly Father, may we never forget the sacrifices of those who came before us. May we never forget those who paid the ultimate price to keep us free. And may we never forget, and indeed may we embrace the gift of the sacrifice made by your Son, Jesus Christ, on the cross at Calvary, for now and for all time. Heavenly Father, we love you. Thank you so much for all you've done for us. And may you keep this country strong, and may you give us the fortitude and the will to make those sacrifices that are necessary. In Jesus' holy and very precious name, I pray all of these things. Amen. Thank you for spending time with me. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And if you did, please touch that like button on the way out and consider subscribing and turning on your notifications. I'd appreciate it. You might also want to check out the other terrific people who are on my featured channels listing and consider subscribing to them as well. They really are great folks to know. Oh, and that list will rotate now and again, so come back and see who else is there. I'll see you next time.